Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm thrilled to be joined by Professor Elaine Fox. Elaine, great to see you.
Hi Dan, and thanks very much for having me on. It's lovely to be here.
No, I'm so excited to speak with you today. We're going to be talking about your new book, Switchcraft. But before we do that, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, Dan. Well, my name is Elaine Fox, and I'm a psychologist, and I'm originally from Dublin in Ireland. So I was born and bred in Dublin, studied there at University College Dublin, and then I actually worked in New Zealand for about 3 or 4 years after my PhD. So I got a lectureship there, and then I returned to the UK in about, I think it was 1994, and I spent most of my career actually in the UK, working at the University of Essex for a long time, and then the last 12 years I've been at the University of Oxford, where I've been running a research lab and a research team. And very recently I've moved to the University of Adelaide. So I was, during the lockdown actually, myself and my husband were both headhunted to come to the University of Adelaide. So I'm the head of the School of Psychology here, and moved out here in just in early February. So it's still all a bit new to me.
Exciting
Yeah.
times. Looking forward to a slightly warmer climate.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Although not at the moment. Not at the moment, actually. It's winter over here at the moment. So.
Wow. As we said off air, I think the Australian winters tend to be quite mild
Yes,
when you think of the UK weather.
exactly.
You're not a sports psychologist. As a psychologist, what branch of psychology have you historically researched in and taught in?
Well, I suppose I've kind of gone through a couple of different areas actually. My background is really in cognitive psychology, so cognitive science, cognitive psychology. You know, how we think, how our brain kind of works. But more recently, I've got very interested in doing a lot of research around emotion and how we react emotionally to different situations. I'm being very involved in mental health research, for example. And actually, I have worked with some sports people so I do a little bit of executive coaching, and including with sports people, to help them with emotional reactivity and kind of cognitive strategies to play better or to perform better in sport. So a little bit of a mix and match of a lot of things, but basically I suppose cognitive psychology and emotion.
And would I be right in thinking when you were at the University of Oxford for a number of years, you headed up a department that very much specialised in research in emotional research?
Absolutely, yeah. So I was very lucky actually that I was awarded a European Research Council Advanced Fellowship, which it's called, which are very nice grants. They're very competitive grants, and they provide your own salary, and they also provide funding to set up a research team. So I set up a research program around my own interests, really around resilience and emotional reactivity, and looking at mental health and well-being in teenagers in particular, but in with adults as well. And so, as I said, I was very lucky to have that funding. It allowed us to do a couple of big studies. The core study was we followed over 500 teenagers from the age of about 12 until they were about 17. So across the secondary school years, really. And we measured genetics, lots of cognitive biases. We interviewed everybody in great detail. We got lots of information about what was going on in their lives to really try and unpick, what are the things that drive resilience and what are the things that drive emotional vulnerability, really, and to see how can we get a better handle on that. So it was quite a big, complicated study.
Absolutely, and I'm sure there's some crossover in terms of what you found and what's in your book, Switchcraft. But just briefly, what were your key findings then from that research project? Because that's such a fascinating area.
Well, as you say, there's definitely an overlap with Switchcraft, because one of the things I really found is that adaptability and mental flexibility is really, really important. And we know, for example, I've worked in the field of anxiety for a long time, for example, and we know that when all of us get stressed and anxious, what tends to happen is we tend to get much more rigid in our way of thinking and in our way of doing things. I'm sure you know yourself, Dan, when you get a bit stressed, you tend to keep trying the same thing. It's like when you lose your keys, you keep looking in the
Yes.
same place and they're not there, but you keep looking in the same place. So we get into these rigid kind of patterns. And so what we find is that actually, if people are much more flexible and can work on their adaptability and mental agility, that was one of the core things that was really linked with resilient functioning. So the children who could find ways around solutions to different problems and try out different things and just keep a more open mind about things. That's a really key factor in resilience. And of course, that's what I write a lot about in Switchcraft.
Wow, a lovely segue there. Flexibility, adaptability, agility. I think we're getting a bit of a clue as to the main themes or the definition of Switchcraft, your book. Before we go there, tell me about the genesis of this book. Where did it all start? Where did it begin?
Well, it started quite a number of years ago. Actually, it's interesting because it's highly relevant to the current situation we're in with the COVID lockdowns, and a lot of people think,
Yes.
"Oh, I wrote it in response to all of that," but actually, I didn't. I started a lot long before we even heard of coronavirus, um, and it's come really from my own research. As I said, showing that adaptability and mental agility is really important. So I've been working in that field for quite a long time, looking at there's a task I use a lot in the lab called task switching, which is how you can switch very rapidly from one mental task to another mental task. And we know that that's really important to basically be more efficient, whether it's in sport or in work life, in all sorts of things. If you can switch very efficiently, generally speaking, you'll be much more efficient in whatever you're doing. So I really felt that kind of work hadn't really been written about in the popular press at all. So I was kind of quite motivated to write that and try and get it out there to a bigger audience. So that's where it really came from, and I have to thank my husband Kevin for the title. So I came up with all sorts of titles. We had a working title was the flexible mind, for example, or the agile mind. But I was talking one day to Kevin about what the book was really about, and it's really about when do we switch and when do we stick. It's making that decision right. So there are times where we need to keep on doing what we're doing. We need to be very persistent, but there are times when actually persistence is just really like banging your head against a brick wall. There's times when actually we need to make the decision. This isn't working. We need to try something different. So when do we switch and when do we stick? So he came up with the title of Switchcraft, which I think was a great title actually. So we went with that in the end. The publishers loved it as well. So that was good.
I think it's a fantastic title, and I feel your pain because when I've written my books in the past, I think it's one of the most difficult things of writing a book is getting that title.
It really is. It really is.
It is, isn't it?
Yes.
People look at you when you say that and they think no chance, but it is. Well, it's called Switchcraft, harnessing the power of mental agility to transform your life. And I believe you've kind of define Switchcraft for us there. It's having the capacity to adapt, to flex, to be agile, to switch tasks. Would I be right in sort of summarizing Switchcraft in that manner?
Yes, it's basically a set of mental talents, if you like, or mental tools that help us to cope with an uncertain world. So the starting point in many ways is that the world is a really uncertain place. And I don't need to tell anybody that nowadays. So we have a war going on in Ukraine, we've had the coronavirus, lockdowns and pandemic. But even before that, in everyday life, we never quite know what's going to happen. Friends get ill, we might get ill ourselves, we might lose our jobs. There's all sorts of unexpected things that happen. So the world is uncertain. And when I've worked with anxious people in particular, anxious people often try and make the world as controllable as possible and as predictable as possible. And of course, that's often a good thing. I mean, we all try to make the world fairly predictable around us and make our environment fairly predictable. But the reality is we have to embrace uncertainty, because uncertainty is genuinely just part of life. And, you or I wouldn't be here if our ancestors hadn't been very good at dealing with uncertainty. So being agile and open and flexible and finding ways around problems is really, really important. So if we fall into this rigidity, that generally works against our resilience. So that's really, I suppose, why I wrote the book, because just really the idea that the world is very uncertain, accepting that, trying to refrain from actually trying to make it more predictable, because we can't really within limits. And so Switchcraft are really a set of skills that help us to cope and thrive with that kind of very uncertain world.
And that's how you open the book. You explain to your audience why Switchcraft matters, and you essentially introduce us to the notion that we should really accept change, be able to adapt to it, to manage uncertainty and worry in this uncertain world. And you even talk a little bit about the flexibility of nature within these opening few chapters. Can you
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it is really interesting when you look at nature. Nature, I mean, we know from evolution that nature is just highly adaptable. If we look all around us, things do change in response to the environment. And that's really at the heart of Switchcraft. It's all about really understanding our environment as well as we can, and reacting appropriately to that. So an analogy I use in the book is that of golf. So if you think of a golfer going out onto a golf course, you wouldn't dream of going out there with just one club, So, I mean, I don't personally play golf, but I actually grew up in Dublin beside a golf club. And I used to see these people going out with a big, heavy bag of golf clubs. And of course, you need that. You need a putter for when you're on the green. You need a different type of club for long shots. If you only had one type of club, you would be extremely good at one type of shot, but you'd actually be really poor at other types of shots. So I think that golf analogy is a very nice analogy for life, really. If we think of life, the idea is really there's no one size solution fits all. And we often try that. We often come up with one or two strategies or tactics so we deal with problems. But actually what I'm saying in Switchcraft is we need a whole range of coping tools. We need a whole range of things. There really isn't any one size solution to fit every kind of life problem. And we know in psychology we've got lots of techniques that we know are evidence-based and are very beneficial. So things like mindfulness, developing a growth mindset, grittiness, all of these things are very important, but none of them are good for every single situation. So my argument is you need a bit of everything. You need everything. And then the key is to find out the right thing for the right situation, the right solution for the right situation. So even things like mindfulness, while it can be very beneficial a lot of the time, can actually really backfire a lot of the time as well. In some situations and for some people, mindfulness just doesn't really work very well. And I have my own personal experience of that, which I can tell you if you like. So I've actually done a lot of work on mindfulness myself. So when I was in Oxford, I worked a bit with the Oxford Mindfulness Centre, and we did a couple of collaborative studies together. And so I thought, well, I better practice what I preach in a way, better practice what I'm studying. So I thought I'll do a little bit of mindfulness myself. So I started doing a little bit of meditation, just in a very simple way. Like every morning I might do 10, 15 minutes of basic meditation. And I didn't tell Kevin, my husband, about this. And it was kind of really interesting. So we have a very kind of good relationship. We chat a lot, we kind of banter a lot. And after a couple of weeks, I said, I did mention to him I was doing this. He started, we noticed that something slightly odd was going on. And he actually said to me a few times, "Are you all right? Is everything okay?" And I said, "Well, why do you keep asking? What's the issue?" And he actually ended up saying to me, he said, "Well, you seem very distant and very glassy." And that was the term he used, like you seem very distant and you're not quite there in a way that you were. And of course, what I realized was happening is that, I've been very lucky in the sense that I've always had pretty good mental health. So, I'm pretty optimistic, generally well balanced, obviously with some exceptions, but most of the time I'm pretty well balanced. And of course, what I realized, given that, when I started doing mindfulness, instead of kind of relaxing me, it was actually making me distant from the world. And I was actually switching off a bit from the world and coming across to somebody I was very close to as actually being a bit absent, if you like, and a bit distant. So in that situation, mindfulness was absolutely the wrong thing for me to do. Whereas at times when you're really stressed and anxious and you need to calm yourself down, then mindfulness can be hugely beneficial. And so I talk a lot about that kind of stuff in Switchcraft, that, actually it's finding the right solution for the right moment. So nothing is either good or bad totally in itself, but it's picking the right task and the right strategy for the right situation is really the key.
Just a couple of things I want to draw on there. I mean, look, I'm completely biased, Elaine, because my background is I played professional golf. So your golfing analogies,
Yes.
I love it, and I could almost extend upon it in as much as in golf we talk about the importance of practicing different types of shots, not just going out.
Yes.
So not just having the tools, I suppose, but also practicing the different tools, finding opportunities to practice those those different tools.
Absolutely.
And again, almost bringing together the analogy of golf and what you were talking about there in terms of one size doesn't fit all. You can pick the wrong club for the type of shot that you've got out on the golf course, and it can go disastrously wrong, of
Yes.
which I probably did far too much as a professional golfer, hence why I'm a sports psychologist now. So I think that's so pertinent, and I think that it reminds me of the challenging craft of being a psychologist and being a coach, in as much as you've got this
Yes.
palette of tools and techniques and maybe concepts and constructs that you can use to help people, and you've got to, I suppose, experience helps you pick wisely.
Yes.
It's a challenge, and it's not just, oh, here's self-talk, or here's this technique or that technique, or a bit of attentional control. It's everybody's a little bit different, so there's a real craft to helping people in that respect, and for people to help themselves. So I assume what you're leaning towards there is people have to work on these things, and it's essentially a bit of a trial and error.
Absolutely, yeah, and you're absolutely right, Dan. Like, I think in sport and in life, as you say, there's lots of different things we can do, lots of different palettes is a nice way of putting it, and we select from the palette. It's really selecting the right one and practicing each one in turn, so that you're kind of ready, when you need that particular situation. So it's useful to get a few techniques from mindfulness, which are very useful to calm you and center you, like deep breathing and so on, and counting your breath and all of that kind of thing. That's really useful to practice on a regular basis, so that when you need it, it's there already. You've already practiced it. And there's lots of other things like that. So it's really developing a whole kind of palette of approaches and coping techniques, and then gradually, with experience, learning the right one for the right occasion. And a lot of, in Switchcraft, one of the things I really point out is that actually nothing counts as much as experience, really. Just really learning, diversifying your mind view, exposing yourself to different opinions, exposing yourself to different life situations. That's really, really powerful. It's a really powerful classroom.
Underpinning Switchcraft are four pillars: mental agility, self-awareness, emotional awareness, situational awareness. I'd love to go through these and pick out for our
Yes.
audience some little bits of advice, some little techniques related to each pillar. Now, that first pillar is mental agility. So I'm assuming what you're saying is to become accomplished at Switchcraft, these pillars underpin your capacity
Yes.
to switch, to engage in flexible thinking and flexibility of feeling. Would I be right in saying that?
Absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. And so I suppose probably the most important pillar is agility. So agility and flexibility is really the main pillar, but it's not agility for its own sake. So there's no point flipping and changing just for its own sake. So that's why that particular pillar is underpinned and informed by the other three. So the more self-aware we can be, the more aware of our situation, the more aware of our emotions and our emotional reactivity, that actually informs our agility. So helps us to make the decision, do we need to stick with what we're doing and keep going, or do we need to switch? So while there are four pillars, I'd say it's almost like agility is the most important, but then those three of self-awareness, emotional awareness, and situational awareness are absolutely critical to help us make the right decision more often than not. And we won't make the right decision all the time, of course, but at least if we get it right more often than not, we're doing pretty well.
Well, give us, from the mental agility chapters, give us some ideas there that might tease us into becoming a little bit more mentally agile.
Sure. There's a whole range of things, and I go through lots of different kind of exercises in Switchcraft. But one very simple way is to try and just, if you like, to try and get more flexible in how we interpret things. like thinking back to a situation that you found very upsetting. So, maybe something happened, somebody didn't behave in the way you expected them to, they let you down in some way, and you might have made a very negative interpretation about that. You may feel very angry about them or very upset about the situation. So think back to a situation like that and just try and come up with another interpretation. There may be another explanation that maybe isn't as negative. So it may be that actually your friend genuinely forgot because they were really busy. They may have been totally overloaded. They may have had, real problems themselves that you didn't know about. So simply just trying to come up with an alternative explanation or interpretation of what happened. And then maybe a third interpretation. So if you kind of practice that on a regular basis, just looking back to some event that inflamed you in some way or that you got very upset about, and just trying to practice coming up with different interpretations. And what you find is that, of course, there often are different interpretations, and some of them are quite benign, and some of them might be more negative. And one of the problems with people who are prone to anxiety and worry tend to always make very negative interpretations. If there's an ambiguous social situation or an ambiguous thing that has happened, people will tend to go for the most negative interpretation. So simply practicing, trying to make different interpretations is one way of kind of waking up your mind, if you like, and helping you to become a bit more flexible. So that's one kind of technique that you can practice on a kind of regular basis.
I've heard just pouncing on something you said there about negative interpretation. I've heard that the brilliant psychologist Dr. Martin Seligman talk about the brain having a negative bias because, from an evolutionary perspective, well, as a species, it helped us survive. I mean, would you equally? I've heard other psychologists talk about an optimism bias as well. So I suppose our brains are a little bit all over the place, and we are a complex system, aren't we? But would you say, by and large, we tend to have a little bit of a negative bias?
Yeah, and in fact, actually, my first book, which was out a few years ago, is called Rainy Brain, Sunny Brain, and it's on exactly that. Because a lot of my research is around where do these negative biases come from, where do positive biases come from, and why are some of us very optimistic and some more pessimistic. And one of the things I argue in that book is that the two big drivers, really, of us, the two big biological drivers, are things that are likely to endanger us in some way, so predators and things that are likely to harm us in some way, and rewards, things that are actually going to benefit us, either as an individual or as a species. So as I say in the book, if there's a predator tracking you, you want to make sure you don't end up as his lunch. So, so avoiding danger is generally more important than approaching reward. So in that situation, the rainy brain is always stronger than the sunny brain. So the negative bias will always outweigh the positive bias. And if you think about it in evolutionary terms, that makes sense. So it's more important to avoid real danger than it is to get a reward. Both are important and both are really big drivers of our behavior, but the negative will always outweigh. And we know that from this lots of psychological research from lots of different areas showing that negative information always weighs more heavily than positive information. So I think that's one reason why the negative biases are particularly difficult to get rid of. And as I argue in Rainy Brain, Sunny Brain, we need our negative biases. We shouldn't try and get rid of them because they actually are alerting us to genuine danger, and genuine problems. But it's only when they get out of control, and again, like in anxiety, for example, when people become very anxious, what tends to happen is the negative bias just gets hyper-vigilant and it gets totally out of control, so that even in very safe environments, people are still thinking very negatively and still seeing all sorts of dangers that just simply aren't there.
They both capture our attention, is what I'm hearing
Absolutely.
you say.
Yes.
And my understanding is a little bit of because I think attention is a really, really important cognitive process for learning and obviously for performance. And my understanding from at a hormonal level is that when we chase rewards, we're releasing dopamine. When we're, conscious of threat, attending to threat, we're releasing norepinephrine. And I think the interesting thing as sports coaches is actually we can potentially tap into that. We can motivate, help players capture attention through reward and through threat as well, is my understanding. But what you're saying is the threat is the one that tends to overpower everything else.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what our research shows, that the negative stuff will always capture our attention to a greater extent than the positive stuff. So it's more difficult to dial down negative news than positive news. And so, for example, again, to use a sport analogy, so getting over a bad shot is really important. You probably know from golf, if you have a really bad shot,
Yes,
if you
yes,
have a really bad shot,
I know
you can
about
dwell on
those,
that.
Elaine. Yeah,
Exactly, yeah. And I've worked with a few snooker players, and it's the same there. If you have a really bad shot, you tend to dwell on it.
yeah.
But what people often don't realize is, by the same token, forgetting about a really good shot is also really important. So if you have a really spectacularly good shot, actually that can be just as disruptive to you, because you're still thinking, wow, I used to play tennis at quite a high level as a junior, and I found that a lot. If I had a really brilliant shot, it would take me 3 or 4 points before I kind of got over that, and you'd easily lose the next 3 points by simply getting kind of captivated. So even though the negative does weigh more heavily, you're absolutely right. Both the very positive stuff and the negative stuff tend to capture our attention.
And I'm guessing this really underpins why it's so difficult to be agile. Again, it comes back to, and I'm looking at this in a very unidimensional way, so please excuse me, but when our attention is captured, whether it's through reward or through threat, it's challenging to switch away
Yes,
from what is captivating us, essentially. So as you said,
exactly.
if bringing this back to sport, or retaining a sense of what this means to sport, you know that let's say that footballer who's made a mistake, or a couple of mistakes, or even a mistake that's fueled negative emotion because of a very bad mistake, that's captivated this footballer's attention. And so having that capacity to switch away from that's tough, that's challenging, that's a real skill, isn't it, to do that in the
It's
moment?
really, it's really, really tough, yeah, but it's really, really important, and that's one of the things in Switchcraft that I really talk about.
Mm.
And one of the exercises, just going back to the kind of exercises
Yeah,
that can help with that, is one of the exercises is to help you switch. Because the other thing I say is that the idea of multitasking is a bit of a myth, really, as you
yeah,
probably know. I think most psychologists realize that we often think we can multitask, but actually what we're really doing is we're switching very rapidly from one thing to another. And that can be very draining. It's very draining to switch constantly, because the simple task of switching away from one thing to another is actually quite draining. But one of the simple exercises I have in the book is coming up with maybe 3 different tasks that maybe it would take you about 3 or 4 minutes, or maybe 10 minutes, say 10-minute tasks, and simply setting a timer to go off after 10 minutes. So it might be something like writing an email, booking a restaurant, doing different kind of tasks. And you just work through these 3 tasks, but as soon as the buzzer goes off, you switch to the next task, even if you haven't finished it. And the more often you do that, the better you'll be able to suddenly learn how to switch and shift to the other task. And if you want to get more sophisticated about that, you can set off a timer to go off randomly, so you never quite know when the timer is going to go off. And that's just a kind of a good exercise that people can do to try and help them to kind of switch. So even though that's a good training exercise to switch rapidly between one task and the other thing I talk about is Switchcraft, which is really important, is that we know that switching from one mental set to another is draining of energy. It literally drains our physical energy. So it's really important to take a little gap between tasks. So the kind of job I have, for example, probably like a lot of people, there's multiple projects, multiple different things I do, and I might be doing 3 or 4 different things in a day, quite different tasks. And the tendency is, especially if you're running behind time, is to, as soon as you finish one, you jump onto the next one straight away. So one of the things the evidence tells us is that that's really a big mistake. What we need to do is take a break, take a little gap between those kind of tasks, even if it's only a couple of minutes. If you stand up, walk around the room, make a cup of coffee, ideally get outside and have a little walk outside. If you can just insert a little gap between those different type of projects, that will really refresh your mind and allow you to kind of, if you like, disengage from the first thing and then prepare yourself to move on to the second thing. If you try and jump from one to the other without that gap, that just really, really drains your energy, and you end up at the end of the day completely mentally and physically exhausted.
I love what you're saying there, because it's my brain's whirring with some ideas here, and it's making me think. When I personally am involved in writing, I love your idea of dividing some time up. 10-minute chunks of time, so I can be more conscientious
Yes,
over that. Each of those 10 minute chunks. Uh, but I do think everything that you're saying has implications for sports and sports practice, for example. I mean, I think all of this is underpinned by when I'm switching tasks, and those might be task irrelevant. So I'm focusing on things that are irrelevant to. I'm switching away from the task that's relevant to me. I'm eating all that
yeah,
sugars and glucose, that are powering the front part of my brain, I suppose, if I was to put it like that. And I'm thinking of the importance for sports people of deliberate practice, and in deliberate practice, the concept created by Anders Ericsson at Florida State University many years ago. Deliberate practice requires effort. It's effortful practice, and so yeah, so we really need to have the capacity to sustain our attention on the
absolutely.
task at hand, to engage in deliberate practice. And the final thing to say there is, for coaches of team sports, between activities. So a coach of a football team might have their players engaged in a small-sided game, and then take a break, and then have a keep ball or something like that. But during that break, players will have a drink, but also really helping the players mentally
Yes,
switch off away from football could be useful to help them retain those sugars and glucose. Do you think that relates there? Yeah.
absolutely. That's absolutely. I think that's absolutely bang on. That's exactly, and there's a lot of research showing exactly that. Actually, Dan, it's exactly right. So, we all tend to, as I said, jump from one thing to the other, but taking that gap is so important, and it just really helps with energy, and and it's almost, it also helps to consolidate the learning that's taken place in the first task. So you just have a little, even if it's only 5-10 minutes, just learning, letting that settle in, letting that consolidate, and then you can prepare your mind for the new task and think about. So you're slightly fresher to think about the new task. So it's really important, I think.
Yeah, that consolidation period for new learning is so vital, isn't it? Things in
Yes,
sport that we're slowly starting to learn ourselves about. Well,
absolutely.
when you practice, it's easy to think, "Oh, I'm practicing for 6 hours a day as a golfer," but actually dividing it up and go, okay, take some time to consolidate that learning is vital.
Exactly.
Now, I'd like to talk about that second pillar, because I know how so important this is to mental agility, but self
Yeah.
awareness. Talk to us a bit about the importance of self awareness. Why do I have to be aware to improve my switchcraft?
Absolutely. Well, it's so important to just be aware of, to dig a little deeper into what really drives you. What is really
Mm,
driving you? What are your values? You need to discover your inner benchmarks, if you like, of happiness or well-being. And it's surprising, actually, when I do a bit of coaching as well with people, it's surprising how many people have never really sat down and considered that. They haven't really asked themselves, what really drives me? Who do I want to be? And it's interesting. It's one of the things that I think a lot of people found in the lockdowns, that actually a lot of people really reevaluated their life. They really reevaluated what they wanted to do. Many people changed dramatically. They decided, actually, I don't really want to be doing the work I've been doing. I want to do something else. So that kind of self-reflection is so important, because a lot of the time, a lot of us go around and we're kind of fulfilling somebody else's dream almost. We're doing things because we've stumbled into a particular job or a particular lifestyle, and it may not actually be in line with our values and what we really want to do. So in that pillar, I'm just really suggesting that people try and develop a deeper understanding of themselves, who they are, and your own capabilities, and how you're likely to react in different situations. So we all know we all react a little bit differently emotionally to different situations. So having a better understanding of that will help you to cope with different situations. If you know that a situation is going to really inflame you and make you very angry, there's things you can do to prepare yourself for that situation. So I think self-awareness is hugely important. So I think it's 2 chapters in Switchcraft around that, and looking
mm.
at different levels of self-awareness, which I talked through.
I think it's fascinating, I get the idea of sitting down and considering one's beliefs and values in terms of becoming more aware of how one responds in different situations. What's your general advice there? Is it to sort of take some quiet time at the end of each day and consider how one has reacted and responded to various situations, or is it to monitor oneself through the day? What, whether it's in your book or in your general consultancy practice, what do you usually advise there?
I think certainly I'd advise having a kind of a debrief session. So as you know, in sport, like teams and sports people will always have a debrief after a
Yes.
match. Say you'll have a session where you'll go through and say, okay, what went well, what didn't go so well. And I think, why don't we do that in everyday life? Why, particularly during a difficult period, if you're, say, working on a project, you're pitching an idea, whatever it is, simply having a debrief with yourself and sitting down saying, okay, what worked really well and what didn't work so well, and why? What, could I have done anything better? So I think that's so important, just to kind of get used to questioning yourself a little bit and how you react to situations. And one of the things I think is very powerful is, which is not a new thing, but it's very, very powerful, is just to keep a journal and just jot a few things down and regularly jot down how you reacted to different situations, because that's all learning. It's all improving your efficiency. And as there's different levels of self-awareness that I kind of talk through in the book. So one is, we all know about kind of personality, and we all know that we have general personality traits or dispositions,
Yep.
so we respond in certain ways. And I've got a few little tests in the book where you can measure that. But it's interesting, that gives quite a superficial
Yep.
level of self-understanding. So there's a psychologist called Dan McLean, who's done some very interesting work on self-awareness, and he calls that type of awareness the psychology of the stranger. So he argues that if you look at personality traits, you can understand a stranger just as much as you can understand yourself with that type of analysis. So actually, what I also talk about in the book is some of his work and other work, which is about developing your own personal narrative, so your own personal story and how you react to situations. And there's some very nice techniques where you ask people to write about 200 words on something like the worst thing that ever happened to you, or the best thing that ever happened to you in your life. So you just sit down and you write that as honestly as you can and as openly as you can in your journal. And then there's a set way of analysing that, which is all in Switchcraft. You can work through it in Switchcraft. And what that does, it helps you identify what are the kind of key themes in your life. So is it a theme of redemption, for example, is quite a common one that comes up. So that's the idea that, a lot of things go wrong, but actually they turn around and they generally work out right for you. Or it might be the opposite. It might be actually, lots of things seem to be going well, but actually they turn bad at the end. So there's different kind of personal narratives, and often we're not very aware of that. But once you understand your personal narrative, that gives you a much better understanding of how you're likely and even why you react in certain ways to different situations. So I give a few exercises in the book looking at that as well, which I think can be very useful.
I love that, Elaine, and it reminds me of the work in. We had actually Professor Dan McAdams on the Sports Psych show
Oh,
from
right.
Northwestern, because I'm a big fan of personality science, and
Yeah,
but
he's done some great work, actually. Yeah.
well, the three levels, as you're kind of attesting to there, that at the trait level, obviously they measure typical responses, don't they? I find them endlessly fascinating, but they do measure typical responses, and they're quite
Yes.
generalised. And then the level above that, in Dan's tripartite model, the level above that is the characteristic adaptations that we spoke a lot about when I had him on the show, and then that narrative identity, which
Yes. Exactly.
really gives that rich cocktail, that mixture of who we are. And so
Exactly.
it makes us endlessly complex beings, doesn't it? Really?
Exactly. And that's really, really important for Switchcraft. I think to have a sense of that kind of narrative is actually really important for Switchcraft.
Yeah.
And then there's other things. One of the things I really talk about, which we've often forgotten nowadays, about the physical body and tuning in more to our physical signals, because our body is very good at giving us signals about what's going well and what's not going so well. So the more we can learn to tune in to those, if you like, intuition or kind of deeper signals.
Yeah.
So I give I talk about a few exercises and some research around that. And there was a lot of interesting research going on in Oxford on that, for example, really trying to understand how we kind of tune in better to our bodies and to the kind of signals, and when we know it's a false signal, not a false signal. So all of that is really important as well, just to be aware of our physical being as well as our kind of psychological reality.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because I wanted to, as an expert in emotions, and doing all this research that you did at Oxford University, I mean, we had Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett on the show, obviously from
Oh yes,
Harvard.
I know Lisa very well. Yeah.
Right, I thought you might do, and
Yes.
and 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 obviously, her, a lot of her work is around the predictive brain and interoceptive processes, the brain capturing that data, creating affect every single second, which affect and sport, I think, that feeling
Yes.
level impacts sports experiences as the game unfolds. And I was going to ask you, if you don't mind me asking you, I mean, do you align with that notion of the embodied nature of our being, that our bodies and brains are obviously one and the same in many respects,
Yes.
and the embodied nature of everything, is that something that you aligned with?
Absolutely, yeah. And again, it's come through a lot of the research. I think it's very difficult to ignore it now.
Yeah.
It's the body is so important, and the signals that the body gives us are so important. And again, in Switchcraft, I talk quite a lot about the predictive brain and predictive
Yes.
coding, because we now know that actually we used to think in neuroscience that we would react to things that happen in the world.
Yes.
But as Lisa, I'm sure, as pointed out, and she makes a big case for this, what we're actually doing is our brain is predicting, at every second, our brain is predicting what's likely to happen. And then we get an error signal. If it doesn't work out the way we thought, well, then we get an error signal, and that's how we learn. If it does work out the way we predicted, well, then things go on as normal. So that actually, and one of the things I talk about in Switchcraft is that system is perfectly designed for adaptability and flexibility.
Mhm.
So because we're predicting everything, it allows us, of course, to really change very rapidly if things aren't working out as predicted. But the downside of that, the kind of paradox of that, is that it's actually very draining. So it's actually very draining of energy. So we need to be that's why it's good in a way to try and make the world as predictable as possible, but at the same time, we have a system that's absolutely designed to be very flexible. And it's kind of relating into both the situational awareness, but also self-awareness. Is one of the things I talk about is that the brain operates on what we call big data. So you're probably familiar with this idea of like big data. So when you have a lot of information, with the naked eye, you can't possibly figure out what's actually going on. But if you put in computer algorithms to complicated data sets, you often find patterns there, and that's effectively what our brain is doing all the time. And so that's what I really think is underlying our intuition. So when we get these intuitive feelings that something is either a good thing or a bad thing, or we should do something in a certain way, that's actually our brain. So what happens is that from the moment we're born, even actually from before we're born, when we're in the womb, our brain is making connections between different feelings and different events, whether it's a sight or a sound or anything, and that combination of events might be linked to a particular feeling, whether it was a feeling of danger or apprehension or something very pleasant. And that's why sometimes we might kind of suddenly get a feeling of apprehension, whether it's about a person or about a situation, or we might feel very pleasant in a situation. And often we're struggling to understand, like, why is that? And actually what is happening is coming from that brain's big data. The brain is giving us information that's not fully conscious, because we simply couldn't consciously process all of that information. But that intuitive feeling is really telling us this is something that's happened before, and it's something important in some way, which is kind of really why it's so important to tune in to those intuitive feelings.
Well, we'll use this as a neat segue to go onto your third pillar. Well, I know we're darting around everywhere here, but what I'm hearing you say is there is a biological and genetic basis of personality. When I say personality, I'm incorporating the experience of feeling and emotion here. And what I'm kind of hearing you say is that, therefore, would I be right in saying that some people would, as a consequence of that biological and genetic basis of personality, be challenged to manage their emotions, to engage in switchcraft more than others? However, everybody can engage in switchcraft with the right tools over time?
Yes, yeah. To answer your question quickly, yes is the answer, and it's one of the things we looked at in the big study I mentioned in Oxford, where we
Yeah.
followed these 500 teenagers for 5 years. What we found was that some of these children were naturally quite adaptable and quite flexible, so it almost came quite naturally to them. Others struggled a lot more, and we've also done some associated studies where we're trying to improve people's flexibility. And so you're absolutely right. So people do start at an individual difference level. So some people would just find that much easier than others. But actually, everybody can improve. So if you actually, and it's like anything, it's like training for sport. If you really, you have to train yourself consistently. It's the kind of thing, there's no magical switch that you can change things very quickly, but it's about changing a number of small things consistently and practicing over time, and just you really, and so like that exercise I gave about the having different tasks and switching from one to the other. If you do that on a regular basis, or even the
Mhm.
like interpreting situations in different ways, if you do that on a regular basis, that will help your mind to become much more flexible and more adaptable. But again, it's something that's not particularly easy, and it's something you have to really do over time.
I'm going down this line of inquiry because embedded into the sports psyche, I think that historically has tended to be this judgment of the person in front of us, the person that we're coaching, young and older players alike. And we've tended to have quite a fixed mindset around mentality. And when I say mentality,
Mm.
I include emotion as well. We can tend to judge. And as sports psychologists, we're trying to help coaches incorporate what we might call a psychologically informed environment, where we're saying, can we be more curious about the person in front of us in terms of their mental world, and subsequently be more curious, be more patient, and then potentially upskill that
Yes,
person to be able to be more agile, which comes back to all the tools and techniques in your book.
sure, yeah.
And so in terms of learning to regulate your emotions, so the third pillar, emotional awareness, learning to regulate your emotions, are there any tools, techniques, anything specific coaches could take away in terms of helping people manage their emotions a little bit better?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of things. I think one thing is when we're in a crisis situation, or if something is going wrong and we're kind of panicking. I mean, the first thing is to just try and step back a bit and decenter. As you know, it's a decentering technique. And just try and decenter, look at the situation objectively, and that can be very powerful. Actually, just step outside the situation and just really analyze it as objectively as you can. I think also just generally accepting the fact that negative emotions can be very, very helpful. I think sometimes we often try to get rid of our negative emotions, whether it's anger or fear, we try to suppress it and get rid of it. But actually, these emotions are there and they're really, really kind of helpful to us. Um, so I think that's one thing to do. Just really accept that these negative emotions are really quite helpful to us, and but also embracing the positive emotions. And just generally speaking, I think a lot of the time we don't appreciate just how important positive emotions are. And so, for example, things like being grateful, being curious, trying out different things. And again, what a lot of Switchcraft is about being very open-minded, opening our mind to different possibilities. So rather than getting into this rigid mindset of this is the best way to do it, this is the only way to do it, actually think, actually, maybe it's not really working for me. Maybe there's another way to do that. And just being open and adaptable to that, I think, is really important.
So that openness starts with awareness, doesn't it? In terms of, I'm aware of I'm like this, I'm aware I'm experiencing this. Can I be more open to other experiences?
Absolutely, that's exactly the point. Yeah, so just being kind of very open, just and just gradually improving that kind of openness is really important, I think.
The fourth pillar is situational awareness. It feels like this calls for interpersonal skills.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us a little bit about situational awareness?
Yeah, so again, situational awareness is very much about really understanding the context. Because as we said at the beginning, the finding the right strategy and finding the right solution it's very dependent on knowing the situation we're in. So, so there really is no one size fits all. And as we said with the golf analogy, that if you're in a particular situation and you use the wrong club or the wrong type of shot for that situation, you're not going to get very far. So, it's really important to try and understand the situation. And that involves tuning into your intuition. So we talked a little bit about intuition. So as I said, our brain actually has a lot of information, and it's not the kind of information that's going to tell us exactly what we should do.
Okay.
That's not what it's for, but it gives us hints. It says, this is something that didn't quite work before in a similar situation, or this is something that did work before in a similar situation. So learning how to tune into that and really understand that is really, really helpful. The more we can do that, but rather than taking it as absolutely, this is definitely what you should do. So ultimately we need both. So you probably know the concepts that come from the dialectical behavior therapy. There's a nice kind of idea there where they talk about the emotional mind, the rational mind, and the wise mind, and that's very relevant for Switchcraft. So the emotional mind is where you react completely on your emotions. You just react instantly to a situation, whether you get angry, you get fearful, you get joyful, whatever it is. You're right, you're actually purely emotionally, no rationality whatsoever. And that could be useful in some situations, but often it could get you into big trouble, of course.
Yeah.
Whereas another version is the rational mind, where you really analyze the situations very objectively, you look at all the facts and figures, and you work it out in a very logical way. And in some situations that's necessary, that's very useful, but in some situations it's also not particularly helpful. So the wise mind, as they call it in DBT therapy, is very much bringing those two things together. So having enough facts and figures to make an informed decision, but also tuning into your intuition and tuning into your emotional reactions to try and bring those together. And that's effectively the wise mind. So I say in the book that actually that's also like the Switchcraft mind. The Switchcraft mind is effectively bringing your rationality together with your emotional reactivity, and to really try and understand the context as best you can. And I give a nice example in the book of that, actually, from sport. And I can't remember the guy's name now, but it was an Argentinian racing driver back in the 50s. He was a very world-famous racing driver. There was one famous instant where he used to, there was, I think it was in the Monaco course, he used to accelerate out of a particular bend. And that was always a strategy. Like, he would go into the bend quite fast and he would accelerate out of the bend and head for the finish line. But for some reason, on this particular occasion, when he came halfway around the bend, it was under a tunnel. So he actually slowed down. And he said it was really kind of inexplicable. Like, as he was coming out of this tunnel, he slowed down when normally he would speed up. And he couldn't really explain why this had happened. So again, in the typical debrief situation with his coaches, and they were looking at it afterwards and saying, like, why did he actually slow down there? And it turned out what actually happened was, literally as he came out of the tunnel and turned around the corner, there was a huge crash all over the track. And if he had sped up at that location, it would have been a disaster. That would have been the end of his race. But he couldn't understand why he did that. How did he possibly know that? And what they finally figured out, they did come up with an answer. They realized, he said, normally when he came out of the tunnel, and he wasn't consciously aware of this, but normally when he came out of the tunnel, all of the crowd would be looking towards him. So all these kind of white faces, if you like, would be looking towards him. But on this occasion, all the faces were looking in the opposite direction. And of course, his brain picked that up. So it's a fascinating story. So now he didn't know that consciously. He wasn't conscious of that. But actually, when they looked back at it and they looked at videos, they realized that's what was happening. So suddenly his brain saw the backs of heads and realized something's wrong. People are looking in the wrong direction. So he slowed down automatically. And of course, it saved him. I think he actually went on to win that race. But if he hadn't done that, if he hadn't tuned in to that intuition, he would have gone straight into the pileup.
That's so fascinating. I think that motor racing driver was Fangio, Juan
You're
Manuel
absolutely right.
Fangio. Yeah.
Thank you. I just forgot to say it for a minute. Yeah, thank you.
What you've just said there is just so fascinating. And I was thinking about it with respect to coaching on the sidelines, a football coach, an American football coach, a basketball coach, and just those three minds, essentially, the emotional, the intellectual, the wise. And if you've got that as a coach, as a framework, whereby you can monitor yourself in the moment in terms of if you're being a little bit too emotional, or when
Yes.
you've just got to stop, take a breath, pause, and then make a decision. And that succumbing to the wisdom, that the intuition. Why am I
Exactly.
feeling like this at the moment? could be based on you've seen something on the court or on the pitch, and you've just got to stop and check in with yourself a little bit longer, and to help improve to optimize your decision making in the moment. I think that's a wonderful framework for coaches
Yeah, it is.
to coach by, on match day.
Yeah, it really is, and I think it's so important. I think a lot of the time we dismiss these intuitive feelings, but actually, as you said, it can be hugely important to really help us to, as you say, notice these very subtle things that we're not really aware of consciously, but actually, and this is where experience comes in. So the more experience we have, the more likely we are to pick up on these subtle cues.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, I just think the ideas, the techniques, the tools in this book are so rich and so relevant for sports coaches, anybody involved in sports, players themselves. You conclude the book with some key principles of switchcraft. So, I mean, I think in summing up everything about the book here, what are some of these principles? What are some of these takeaways for coaches to finish on here?
I think, so thanks, Dan, for those nice words, by the way. But I think, there's a number of things. I think certainly, I suppose the number one thing is becoming more comfortable with uncertainty. So really accepting that things are uncertain. And of course, sport is a classic example of that. It's, we wouldn't enjoy watching sport if things were certain. We don't know the outcome. It's a bit more stressful when you're a player and you're actually on the pitch or, in a game. But actually, it kind of just accepting that actually that's just the way things are, and things are uncertain, and getting more comfortable with that. And again, experience is powerful for that. But there are some techniques I talk about in the book that help us to deal with that. I think really then nurturing your agility as much as you can. So nurturing your flexibility. So again, I've done a little bit of work with some footballers, for example, where we actually work very explicitly on cognitive flexibility and on being more agile, to try and help you become more agile. So switching rapidly from one thing to the other. That's really, really important. And just trying different strategies. It's very important for coaches as well to try different strategies and mix and match different strategies, and try and be alert to falling into rigid patterns, because we all tend to do that. And particularly, as we said at the beginning, when we're under stress. So if things aren't going well, if we're under stress, we're behind with only a few minutes to go, we tend to revert to very rigid patterns of behavior. So the more we can try and force ourselves to be open and agile, the better we'll be, the more efficient we will be, really.
Absolutely fascinating. Some wonderful guides there, some wonderful principles. Elaine, how can people, firstly, how can people get hold of this book, and how can people follow you and follow your work?
Well, thanks, Wolf. First of all, the book is called Switchcraft, and it should be in most good bookshops, hopefully. And it's certainly on Amazon and all the online places, but hopefully it's in the usual bookshops. I'm also on Twitter, so I'm at Prof Elaine Fox, so I'm on Twitter. I'm also just very recently on Instagram, so I haven't quite got my head around Instagram yet, but I am on Instagram, same handle, so at Prof Elaine Fox. So I'd really appreciate people following me on Instagram, actually, and maybe giving me a few tips about how to actually use Instagram better. But I'm on Twitter. I've been using Twitter for a while, so I'm kind of on there. But yeah, I'd be delighted if people follow, and I'm always happy to engage in discussions around Switchcraft. And as I said, I think it's genuinely one of the reasons I wrote the book was to really try and help people cope with a very uncertain world, because particularly nowadays, I think a lot of people are struggling with that. And I think that there are ways we can improve our ability to cope and even thrive in a very uncertain world. And I think a lot of it is, I end the book by actually saying, and it can sound a bit trite at times, but I kind of say that we should enjoy the journey in life. Like life can be a real joy, and we often get really burdened down by all the negative stuff that's going on. And of course, there are lots of really negative stuff, but there's also tremendous joy in life. There's great things that happen. Nature is wonderful. There's lots of really good things out there. So really, I'm trying to encourage people by using some of these principles to try and actually enjoy their life a little bit more.
Well said. Well said.
Thank you.
Professor Elaine Fox, I can't thank you enough for your time. Thank you so much for today.
Well, thanks so much, Dan. And really thank you for having me on. I've really enjoyed our chat.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast. And I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.